Welcome back. Now that we've talked about data visualization, I'd like to show you another image, one that tells an interesting story. So this is a map of the United States at night, taken from low orbit. And what I want you to notice right away is what it's able to tell us about America. The points of light that we're seeing here have an eerie glow, like stars in the sky, but they really represent cities that are scattered all over the country. If we were to look at a population map, it'd be very close to what we're able to see here in terms of how concentrated the population of the United States is in various areas. And you can almost see the outlines of the states and the borders of the country because of the way the lights appear along natural boundaries. But as you're looking at this image, I also want you to think about what this image has to say about not just where we live, but how much of the United States is still untamed and wild over here on the western side compared to the eastern side. This picture isn't just telling a story about how we live today, but about how the United States exists today, and also how it's evolved over time, and how much of it is still left to grow and develop in the future. Now, to some people, this image is tragic, representing a peculiar dynamic between natural darkness and artificial light. To others, it suggests human progress and innovation, given that it's a literal picture from space showcasing the progress humans have made. Whatever you see here, there's a story that can be told, and it's much richer and more exciting than just presenting the data about how densely populated different regions of the United States are, or how much energy we consume in those areas at night. So I want you to think about the power of an image like this as you think about how you can talk about the data in a qualitative study, because what really makes that image work is the drama that's contained within it. And drama is at the heart of good storytelling, but it's also something that doesn't occur naturally. It requires a human storyteller who can piece events together and understand how an audience might react to what's being shared. But storytelling isn't just about finding stories to insert in the midst of sharing your data. It's often about making the sharing of your data feel like a story itself. Now, I want to specify upfront that when I say storytelling, you're probably thinking that I'm talking about taking time out from your report or your presentation to add in some anecdotes or cute stories or aside or things like that, maybe from your research, maybe from your own life, to break up the dull task of talking about your data. But let's think bigger than that. Presenting data is itself an opportunity to tell your audience about a quest for knowledge or a search for a solution to a problem. An arduous analysis that required you to piece together the evidence like a jigsaw puzzle to solve the mystery of something that needed to be understood. Using anecdotes or asides can help towards that goal, but when I say storytelling, what I really mean is sharing your report or presentation in a format that itself tells a broader story. And as a lecturer and a frequent public speaker, I often have to think about how I can present information that I want to share in the format the audience actually wants to hear. Because I've learned that one of the ways you can be really ineffective as a speaker is to start talking without first letting your audience know where you're going. When information is being presented, we need to know how that information connects to a broader purpose. And if that connection is not established, the speaker becomes a rambler, someone who is just talking without thinking about where they're going without thinking about what they're saying. That's fine for having a conversation, but it's not effective for helping an audience to follow along in a talk or in a report. Fortunately, storytelling is a great tool for adding structure to help your audience connect with what you're sharing, provided that you take some time to understand how storytelling actually works. One of the best tips that I've ever been given is that we as human beings are naturally driven by an affinity for tension and release. Now, think about this: tension, release, tension, release. It's the rhythm of our heartbeats, the very drumbeat of our lives. It's how we breathe, it's how we communicate, it's how we write by using periods and paragraph breaks. It's an ebb and flow, it's a rhythm and refrain. It's part of everything that we do. It's also what makes dramatic storytelling so compelling. A good storyteller can take some information, place it in the context of a problem or a question, and direct the audience towards wondering how that information is going to solve the problem or resolve the question. The audience feels the tension of wondering and then the release of knowing. The release is a pause, a moment to breathe, before the speaker begins another squeeze. What's more, the same approach can work in written reporting as well. You start with a problem, you explain your solution, and then you show your work along the way about how you get there. The tension is the problem itself and addressing what's been learned about it. The release is explaining how the data solved the problem and then providing supporting evidence to show how you got there. In qualitative reporting, one of the easiest frameworks for creating the storytelling cycle of tension and release is to break your study into research objectives or research questions and address them one by one. Start with what you were trying to learn and then explain how you arrived at your eventual conclusions. Conclude the section and then move on. This works much better than simply presenting your data as a big mass and then trying to tie it all back to conclusions at the end of your report or presentation. That's the conventional style, but it just doesn't work because this other method with tension and release allows your audience to see the connection between what you set out to learn and what you feel you did learn. Again, tension, release, tension, release. You're not just sharing data, but telling a story about how what you collected helps to solve a problem or promote understanding. The drama feels natural, and the story provides a framework to help keep your audience engaged. Now, telling an effective story usually involves structure, and if you think about books you've read, or movies you've enjoyed, or TV shows that you've watched, you probably already have a fairly intuitive grasp on how a story should be put together. Start with a setup that presents where things are initially, set a goal of where things are going, and then explain the progression to get to that point. So think about Star Wars. Luke Skywalker begins as a farm boy on Tatooine who wants to fight against the evil Galactic Empire. And by the end of his story, he's on his way to destroy the Death Star and to become a hero. Everything that happens to him along the way supports his progression and his transformation towards that goal. Think about Harry Potter. Harry Potter is a boy of great promise who somehow defeated the evil wizard Voldemort when he was a baby. And he's believed to be the only one who can defeat Voldemort again if this evil wizard ever returns. Everything that happens to Harry along the way shows us how he becomes a wizard and manages to become powerful enough to vanquish this great evil. Think about the Avengers. The Avengers start out as a group of heroes who are used to doing their own thing their own way, and they're constantly butting heads and bickering and fighting as they try to find a reason to actually work together. But then Loki gets powerful enough that they actually have no choice but to team up and use their powers to help one another out in a big climactic battle. Everything that happens from the setup to the moment where the Avengers eventually assemble is meant to help support that big moment. All of this is part of the framework of a good story. The beginning of a story is called the setup, and it establishes where the story is going. And the conclusion of a story that resolves the setup is called the payoff. And believe it or not, you can use this technique in qualitative research by setting up what it is you're trying to understand and making the payoff the eventual conclusion of what you learned. So another good storytelling technique that's really effective is to introduce some mystery at the beginning of a story that begs to be solved. This technique's been used quite a bit in books, films, and TV shows to string an audience along. Detective stories have been popular fodder for novels for over a century, and Sir Conan Doyle's Sherlock Holmes books and Agatha Christie's novels are two of many examples of how novels have been used to provide a mystery that can tell a compelling story. Those techniques work well in films too, and creating an entire genre and style of detective movies happened as a result of the power of mystery storytelling. But mystery also powered the stories that came behind some of the greatest movies that were ever made. For example, at the beginning of the classic film Citizen Kane, the audience sees Charles Foster Kane on his deathbed and hears his final word. But it takes the entire exploration of his life to understand the significance of what that word actually means. There's another classic film called Sunset Boulevard that shows us at the very beginning that the main character who's narrating the film is lying dead in a swimming pool. And the story is intended to help us understand how what we're going to see eventually leads to that violent conclusion of him being dead. This technique translates to television too. The classic show The Fugitive was all about solving the mystery of how an accused murderer was framed by what he insisted was a one-armed man who'd really murdered his wife. Many years later, David Lynch's show, Twin Peaks, used the murder of Laura Palmer to string audiences along into a very strange and surreal world filled with offbeat characters and supernatural occurrences. And many contemporary movies, TV shows, and streaming shows use mystery as a means of keeping the audience's attention. Even podcasts like Serial or documentaries like Making a Murderer have used this technique to great effect. Now, the one thing I'd caution about mystery, however, is that once the mystery is revealed, the story does lose a lot of its power to continue on. So make sure that you save the solution for your payoff and don't allow people to figure out where you're going until you're ready for them to know. Many years ago, the movie The Sixth Sense was very popular when it first came out in theaters because it had a twist ending that few audience members saw coming. And once it hit people, it hit them well. Once the film got popular, though, and the ending got spoiled by a lot of popular culture, the movie lost much of its ability to surprise new viewers. That's one reason that spoilers are such a big deal to some people when it comes to popular entertainment, because they ruin the fun of finding things out. Well, in research, presentation, and reporting, the same thing can happen to you if you choose to build up a mystery with your data and reveal the exciting conclusion only to realize that you've already tipped the audience off to where things were heading. So be careful that if you have something big you're going to give away as your payoff, that you save it until the very end. So good storytelling involves structure, and here are a few suggestions that you can use when you're reporting or presenting data, whether it's in a written format or a verbal presentation. One of these things is the customer journey, and this is often useful in an exploration context because it allows you to explain the process a typical customer uses to purchase or make use of a product or service. Now, we could use a journey map as a visualization here, but we don't have to have one of those. We can just talk about it in our written format or in our presentation. But that story of how we start out at the beginning of a process and end up at hopefully a desired location and what happens along the way is interesting and compelling. Another thing that we can think about are contrasting quotes, and these are often good in a drill down context because we could have two quotes that are talking about the same idea but from a different perspective. Maybe we're doing a customer satisfaction survey and we have two different people, one of which is saying, wow, the service was great, the communication was awesome, I really enjoyed my time, and the other person is saying completely the opposite. Wow, the service was awful and the communication was just non-existent and I'm never coming back. Well, how do we get to those two states and why do those two states exist? And is that person that's saying something negative a one-off? Is that person that's saying positive, maybe being paid by the boss to say something nice? Using those anecdotes to explore the dynamic between why two different points of view exist can be a really effective storytelling structure. Deliberation can come from, and it can be really useful in the context of idea generation. It can come from discussing a difficult problem and then the novel solutions, and maybe even a few reasonable ones, that were proposed to help solve it. So this is where you can have some fun. You can maybe talk about some of the off the wall stuff that came out of your data and have a good laugh about it, but then zero in and focus on the more serious suggestions and try to understand where the real opportunities lie to solve the problem that you're setting up to solve through the discussion that emerged. You could also have a horse race. Horse races are great for testing. They use them in political polling all the time. Discussing test items in the framework of a competition. So you're looking at two different concepts. We're putting them up against each other. We assume they have equal chances of winning, or maybe one is a sure thing and the other is a dark horse. But we can build a case for the winners and losers based on the data collected and make the dramatic changes in status between the two as the research goes on something that's compelling and interesting, so that by the end the audience actually has a favorite that they're rooting for and that they're hoping will win. Building up that drama makes a big difference. And then metaphor. I use metaphor all the time. It's great for exploration or drill down. That's where you link research data to some other real world phenomena or experience and help the audience to connect the seemingly strange to what's already familiar. Now, I realize I'm making things sound really easy here, and the truth is that crafting a good story takes time, creativity, and lots of practice. As a working professional researcher, I find that a lot of times I'm not able to put nearly enough time into crafting the story I want to tell because I'm in such a rush to get a report or a presentation ready for a client, and I'm forced to rely instead on a simple structure instead of being able to weave a more interesting or engaging approach into my report or presentation. I have had stories fall flat because I didn't put enough time or thought into how I was telling them. And I've also had data that were so unexciting that I've had trouble finding a good story to tell about them. But in my own work, I'm always striving to be better because I've found that when I can tell a successful story that communicates what the data really have to say, the audience not only remembers what I had to share, but is excited to hear more of it down the road. Well, I hope this lecture has been encouraging to you and helping you to think about ways in which to make your research data sound less like a book report and more like the book itself. In our next lecture, we'll talk about the art of presenting research to an audience.